But now I'd like to introduce the speakers here this evening. First, I'd like to introduce Professor Terry Kramer, who's a UCLA alumnus, and he's also an adjunct professor of technology management and serves as the faculty director of Easton's Technology Management Center. Some students, Anderson students, may have already taken his core technology management course, his tech and society course, or may even have taken the global immersion course that he teaches for the center that focuses on technology-driven transformation and innovation in the Greater China region. He'll also be teaching the course for us again next year. Professor Terry Kramer has extensive technology and leadership expertise in the domestic and international telecommunication industry, where he enjoyed a 30-year career. 18 of those 30 years, he worked for Vodafone in a variety of executive roles, both domestically and internationally. While serving as an entrepreneur in residence at his alma mater, Harvard Business School, in 2012, he was appointed by President Barack Obama to serve as ambassador, head of the US delegation for the World Conference on International Telecommunications. This delegation actually formulated and communicated the US policy regarding the criticality of a free and open internet, as well as an inclusive multi-stakeholder governance and the need to proactively address cybersecurity issues. Fortunately for us, he is now a full-time adjunct professor at Anderson. Please join me in welcoming Professor Terry Kramer. I'm next going to introduce, before we hear from Professor Terry Kramer, Professor Andrew Selbst, who is an assistant professor of law at the UCLA School of Law. Prior to joining UCLA, he was a postdoctoral scholar at the Data and Society Research Institute and a visiting fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society Project. Professor Selbst's research examines the relationship between law, technology, and society. And over the last several years, his research has focused on the effects of machine learning and artificial intelligence on varied legal regimes, including discrimination, policing, credit regulation, data protection, and tort law. His research has appeared in many preeminent legal publications, including the California Law Review and the International Data Privacy Law. He worked as a design engineer before attending law school at the University of Michigan, and then following law school, he was a privacy research fellow at NYU School of Law's Information Law Institute, and also an Alan Morrison Supreme Court Assistance Fellow at Public Citizen Litigation Group. So please join me in welcoming Professor Terry Kramer first, and then secondly, we'll hear from Professor Andrew Selbst. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy, and I hope you guys can hear me okay. I want to first just thank Lucy for bringing all of us together, because I can't think of a more timely and relevant topic, something that's affecting all of us today, real time, and something that's significant in impact. Eric Schmidt, who's a former CEO of Google, recently was talking about the number of antitrust cases that are being brought against U.S. tech companies. Certainly in China, you're seeing a massive focus on tech. But one of the comments that he made that was so interesting is he said a lot of these issues we're seeing today are a manifestation of the growing penetration of technology. All the services that we use, whether we're in e-commerce or social networks or AI for healthcare, et cetera, is that there's a growing penetration of these, and you're going to have more and more issues get created. So when Lucy was talking about this balancing act, that to me is the most important element. It is easy to get ideological and absolutist on one side or another, but figuring out how do you create the right outcomes that benefit technology and its users, which traditionally technology is cheaper, better, and faster. Now that's obviously the promotional line that people would use, but you do see a lot of companies are able to offer that, but you also see a growing set of tech-lash issues. Data privacy issues, antitrust issues, cybersecurity issues, future of work issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And how do you balance those matters? So I want to share a few thoughts with you here. Let me see if this will advance. So to the point about something being timely, Friday's Wall Street Journal talked about the latest in ransomware. It is on pace this year to 2x increase over the previous year. It was a monitoring of what looked like suspicious payments that had been reported by banks. And again, numbers up twice. This is a big area of focus in the Biden administration. Next slide. So what I'd like to do in just a few minutes' time is make sure there's kind of a level set about what is going on. And whenever I think about business problems or opportunities, and for those of you that take my classes, you already know this, and for those that are going to take them in the future, you'll see it in the future, everything in my mind is wired around three things when you're looking at an opportunity or challenge. One is, what's the problem you're trying to solve? The second thing is, what do you know about context? What do you know about what's going on with technology and consumers and public policy and a variety of things? And then ultimately, what would you go do? Otherwise, we're kind of shooting from the hip about what we think the problem is and what needs to get solved. So in this environment, the problem very much is, how do we reduce the cyber attacks, the cybersecurity challenges, while not creating an unintended consequence of lack of benefit of technology and technology-based businesses? How do you strike that balance, to me, is the problem. What I'd like to cover just briefly is what are some of the kind of state of the union issues in cybersecurity. The types of attacks, the targets of the attacks, because they're very different targets of the attacks, recent trends, and what are the costs of these? Obviously, if the costs are small, we don't need to worry about anything. The costs are large, you got to worry a significant amount. Then the next issue is, once we have all of that, who owns the problem? There's a lot of players involved in cybersecurity related issues. Businesses and individuals and governments and regulators, etc. And then the final area I'd like to cover is areas of innovation and potential solutions. So first of all, types of cyber attacks. They are very, very broad. There's not one single type. So denial of service, anytime you get an outside player that wants to stop the workings of the internet, you have a denial of service. It doesn't even need to be for ransom. It's just somebody that wants to see an interruption of service. Phishing attacks, people that mislead others to get them to provide confidential information, their passwords, their birth dates, other identifying information. Password attacks, similar idea, somebody that gets you to share what your password is, they then use it in some other context, and they're able to monopolize on that information. Malware, probably one of the most worrisome events that occurred just a few months ago was the SolarWinds attack that affected our US government. So basically, unbeknownst to others in a software upgrade, you basically had malicious software that then caused huge problems. The other one, ransomware, and by the way, if you remember the Continental Pipeline, I think it was about a year ago, it provides basically fuel, natural gas, for 45% of the east coast of the US. They were attacked and interrupted all of the energy capabilities. So lots of different types. What are the targets? Individuals, businesses, and government. They're very different types of attacks, different players. If any of you want to see an interesting interview of President Obama, just about a month before he left office, he was interviewed and asked what are the biggest worries that he sees for the nation. Number one issue was cyber attacks. It wasn't conventional warfare and battles with XYZ country. It was cyber attacks that would affect the infrastructure of the United States. It would affect the stock exchange. It would affect energy. It would affect water, etc. The number one area. So as much as we all feel the individual cyber attack impact, think about what it would be on a national basis. So it's huge. With all of this not being bad enough, what are two key trends to overlay on top of all of this? The number of connected devices. So wearable devices, connected homes, connected cars, etc. That number is going to increase threefold in the next 10 years. There are now about 25 billion connected devices in the world, going to about 75 billion. They provide a whole range of great services. So again, the answer isn't, well, let's stop all the connected devices, but it's what do you do with every single connected device being a potential breach? So that's a key trend. The second one is remote working. Remote working is creating lots of nightmares for big companies because of lack of security of people working in remote areas accessing company information. And by the way, for all of you that say that we're going to go back to this old environment of being in person, Every single study that's been done recently saying that is not true. There's a study by McKinsey Global Institute that surveyed CEOs saying how many people your employees want to go back in person. They kind of thought 60, 70% wanted to go back 4 days a week. That number was inverse. It was maybe 25, 30% actually want to go back fully in person. So in general, the mode is people want to work remote. That is going to increase the challenge. So what are the costs of all of this? There's huge financial costs of this, right? So loss of money with attacks, etc. Companies have loss of productivity. When they're trying to deal with these issues, they're not developing products, they're not serving their customers, etc. You have reputational harm. So think of some of the big organizations. You have the Social Security Administration. Even think of Target stores that have this kind of question now saying, wait a minute, you didn't protect my information. I don't trust you. And if you're in a corporate environment, that trust is key to future business, to more information being shared, etc. So reputational harm is big. Legal liability is large. Target, by the way, and I think it was 4 or 5 years ago now, when they had their breach of all the credit card info, there was a class action suit against them saying, you didn't manage data well. They're just settling it all now. Huge costs, and again, reputational impact. Business continuity, and then national security, as I mentioned the Obama interview. Who owns the problem? Again, because of all these different types of attacks, individuals own it. There's a certain amount that says individuals, caveat emptor, they need to be taking the right actions to protect their information. That's kind of one argument, one player. Businesses own it. If they're viewed as being irresponsible in this, they're going to have a huge problem. Industries, you can make an argument that industries get tarnished if one player does something wrong. So industries may have a significant interest, and then regulators and ultimately governments, elected officials. So what are some of the solutions? There are a bunch of technology-based solutions that are very interesting. So, use fire to fight fire here. Biometrics and two-factor authentication. So the ability to recognize via image recognition or putting your thumb on a device or two-factor authentication to protect your identity and your interactions. By the way, many of these have got concerns around them on data security, especially on image recognition. Very effective way to identify somebody in most cases, but yet creates a separate problem if it's not administered and developed in the right way. Artificial intelligence. So Facebook, when you're following, I'm interviewing Roger McNamee later this week. It's going to be a fascinating discussion. He's got some very clear views about how Facebook has fouled up. Well, one of the articles that just came out this week is saying, Facebook says, we can use artificial intelligence to identify misinformation, disinformation, et cetera, et cetera. They just had several of their engineers come out and say, you know what? It doesn't work. It's not effective enough. Yes, it sounds good. Yes, it's the future, but no, it doesn't work right now. So an interesting dilemma, but if you could get it to work, you could fight fire with fire. Behavioral analytics, down to an individual, if you could understand regular patterns of activity, what somebody buys and when they access the internet, you could then use that information to say, this is something unusual. This seems like somebody else is accessing somebody's account. Again, you could say there's some data privacy issues there, but it's also being used to help eliminate cyber attacks. Blockchain, digital registries that can keep track of transactions and ownership of content is viewed as being more secure than many other areas. That could be a solution. And then zero trust models overall, saying we're going to design our networks assuming we can't trust anybody. And that may be a potential solution. So what are some of the considerations? And this is my last slide, and I hope it'll kind of engender an interesting conversation. Is first of all, what are the roles and responsibilities here? So how much of the solution lies with individuals? How much of it actually lies with businesses? How much of it lies with government? And generally in my ripe old age, I've realized the world is a very complex place. There are no easy answers on a lot of the stuff. And the challenging issue is to look at what the trade-offs are and how do you make the best balanced trade-off. One of the questions I'm going to pose to Roger McNamee, even though I agree with many of the things he's saying, is Facebook, we kind of have a US-centric view of it, but 80-90% of all their users are in developing markets where the willingness to pay is very low. They're offering a free model, and for a long time, they were helping democracy in many places. The Arab Spring is an example. So just saying, well, listen, I want to do a paid model, and I'm okay with, fewer users, et cetera, not necessarily a good outcome. So you want to look at what are the roles of the different players. And when I was in the State Department, it was always interesting, what is the role of government versus multi-stakeholder, which is government, industry, civil society, versus individuals. We may say government is great, but remember, not all governments look like our government. They may not be democratic governments. So when you're allowing a government that's not democratic to access information, you do need to ask the question, what are they accessing that information for? So not to put a judgment that one thing is good or bad, but to think about what are the trade-offs and where do these solutions work and where do they not work. Can businesses self-police? So I love to challenge my students. It is absolutely easy to say, bring on the regulation. Mark Zuckerberg's saying this right now. He's very shrewd. Bring on the regulation because he knows we're in a politically divided environment and there's going to be no decision made that's substantive on areas of cybersecurity. So bring on the regulation. It's a complete punt. So if you can self-regulate, you got a much better outcome. Can businesses self-regulate and eliminate the chance for unintended consequences of regulation? Is there enough capital going into innovation? Hopefully the answer is yes. If the answer is yes, you have more chance of good solutions there. Are regulations and penalties necessary? This is where Andrew and I are going to have a great conversation. Is it necessary? And if you do say yes to that, what are the unintended consequences of that? So Roger McNamee just said he believes there should be an FDA for all technology products that approves all products. And I thought, oh my God, I just fell off my chair and thought, when you think of all the iterations and number of products that technology companies develop, and to think that all of them are going to need to be reviewed like a vaccine would be reviewed, think about what would happen to innovation. So thinking about these trade-offs to me is a huge one. And then the final and ultimate one, and Lucy said this at the very beginning, how do you balance all of this? How do you get the best of technology, which has mostly changed people's lives for the better, and still manage the bad stuff? And that bad stuff can create bigger bad stuff, but how do you balance all of this together? That to me is the holy grail. So let me stop on that. I'm going to turn it over to Andrew. Lucy, thank you for bringing us together and look forward to a good conversation.
Thanks, Terry. That was a great presentation. I'm going to focus on one little aspect of the who owns the problem and ask like what regulators, what regulations, what governments are even supposed to do about this, right? So, or first I'll ask, what do they do and try to think through what can be done, right? What's the role of law here? So the first thing to think about is that when we think about regulating, information issues, right? People tend to lump privacy, data security, and cybersecurity all together, including the law itself tends to lump a lot of these things together. So a lot of the law are based on these idea called the Fair Information Practice Principles from 1973, adopted by the OECD in 1980, and basically became all of our sort of data everything law. And in there are issues of transparency. There are issues about data minimization, which is one way to deal with a data security problem before it becomes a problem. And then there's like security issues. So it all gets lumped together. So the first thing, just as a matter of terms, right? When people talk about cybersecurity, it's often more the infrastructural denial of service attacks and things like that. Data security is often about did your data escape, right? Did you get hacked or whatever? I know more about the latter, but the regulations tend to be the same, and I think what I'm gonna say is applying to both. So here's the real challenge, right? Everyone gets hacked. We have data breaches all the time, always. And we can't get at the people doing the data breaches. Right? So often, particularly in, say, the US, right, the people who are actually who are stealing data, who are doing the phishing attacks or whatever, are not in the US, right? So it's not really necessarily subject to US law, are hard to find. You can't find them. You have no idea who they are, right? So how on earth do you go after them? So this is the problem we're starting with, right? We're saying everyone's getting hacked, lots of things going down, and we can't actually deal with the person responsible. And so the reason we're asking what to do with businesses on this is because we're faced with this sort of moral quandary of how much blame do we lay at the feet of the business that in some sense was a victim, right? They're the ones that get hacked, and they're the ones that get taken down and lose people money as a result, but they get taken down. They lose data. They get, what is it that's their fault? And so that's sort of the real challenge in regulating data security and to a degree cybersecurity. So the way we do this is kind of a hodgepodge, right? We don't have any sort of overarching regulation. There are a whole bunch of sources of this kind of regulation. So consumer protection law is one where data is one in the US, especially where data is protected. The Federal Trade Commission is the primary regulator over data security and privacy in the US. State attorneys general also work with consumer protection law and can go after companies for letting themselves be breached. I'll talk about that more in a minute. There are some federal sectoral regulations about this. In healthcare, in banking, right? Very specific sectors where we expect incredibly sensitive data, there are much more targeted laws. There's data breach notification laws. Most states have them. In Europe, the GDPR, right, has data breach notification laws. That's one of the ways they approach this. It's actually kind of legally not really that interesting. You just have to breach. The laws tell you, like, or you have to notify after a breach, and the laws tell you, like, 24 hours or 72 hours and what size font you need on the form. But that's the thing that actually a lot of businesses, turns out, care about, because it's actually really expensive and hurts the reputation of the company, so they're really important. There's a lot of private ordering agreements, right? Contract law comes into place a lot of this. I'll talk about that more in a second. And then there's a law called the CFAA, which is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, that actually regulates hacking. It's like the one law that goes after the hackers themselves. Again, not really going to talk about that much, because it turns out it's also used to go after security researchers who are claimed to be hackers, and that's what's in the news more, and that's what we had the Supreme Court case about last year and things like that. Anyway, okay. Point is, right, huge distribution of ways we regulate this, and what do you make of all that, right? What is the overall approach? I would say that the overall approach as a result is to go back to this point that we can't necessarily always blame the business. And so we need to figure out how and when we're allowed to blame businesses, right? So that gets to two ideas. One is reasonableness. In my first day of my torts class, I tend to put up this slide that I wish I had the meme up here. I did not prepare enough in advance to get you this meme, but there's this meme that some of you might have seen with like this building falling down and being propped up, and it says the entire American legal system, and down here is like the word reasonable. It's true, though. The entire American legal system rests really, really hard on the word reasonable, and this is no difference, right? So first we want to ask, what is reasonable? What is reasonable in protecting people against hacks, against data security breaches, against cybersecurity breaches, right? And the other one is a compliance framework. Right? So maybe it's too fact intensive to say, were you being reasonable in this particular instance, and say, we don't have the way to evaluate that. Instead, we're going to say, here are the practices that you should be doing. If you're in compliance with them, fine. Right? So those are really overall the two approaches that get mirrored throughout a whole bunch of different types of law. So let me tell you about some of those specific areas of law, right? So the biggest one, and when we talk about innovation, hey, the government innovates. The last 15 or so years, the Federal Trade Commission has been using their authority to police unfair and deceptive practices to go after companies that don't do anything on data security. right? So they've become a de facto privacy security regulator. We don't have one in the US, right? In Europe and in a lot of the rest of the world, there are data protection authorities that are charged specifically with doing this kind of work. In the US, we do not have that, so the FTC has taken on that role. Now, the FTC gets to do this because their remit is to regulate unfair and deceptive practices that affect commerce, which is basically as broad as it sounds, right? And so what they've taken that to mean is that these data security practices, when you come in and don't do anything and then get hacked, is unfair to the consumers that gave you their data with an assumption that you would do something to protect their data, right? In this day and age, we know this happens. You gotta do something, right? So their approach is that, well, because they getting technical in a second, but they lack really good rulemaking authority, so they use enforcement, right? So they go after people, they enforce, they bring cases against the worst of the worst actors. One famous case that actually, I'll say most of the cases settle, right? They settle and there's a consent decree, right? An agreement that the FTC retains jurisdiction for 20 years. They make some reports for anywhere between 2 and 5 years. They implement a security program. They appoint a data protection officer. There are all these pretty standard things that go into an FTC settlement agreement, and they don't admit liability, so there's this thing that keeps happening, right? The FTC lays out what they did wrong. They admit to none of it. But over time, we get an idea of what it is the FTC is expecting you to do. And some people have called this a quasi-common law, which makes sense, right? At the same time, these are like the things you don't do, the worst of the worst. They also have a guideline document that's like, here's what you should do. Please pay attention to this, and then nobody does. Anyway, so some of these cases get litigated, rarely. There's one called FTC v. Wyndham, which Wyndham Hotels challenged the FTC's authority to do data security regulation at all. Because again, no one said they could do it, right? They just said, it's unfair to consumers, and we get to say what's unfair to consumers, right? So the Wyndham Hotels came in and said, hey, we had no notice this was unfair. This is beyond your remit. What are you doing? This is, you can't possibly hold us against this, or hold this against us. And the Third Circuit came back and said, what the hell are you doing in court? You guys got hacked 3 times. You didn't have firewalls. Your passwords were 1, 2, 3, 4. Not literally, the last one I actually don't remember what, it was basically you just didn't change your passwords. And that's the thing, right? The FTC is not, it's weird. They've innovated a lot on this, but they've also been not super out on a limb on a lot of these things. They'll only go after actors that are the worst of the worst because they don't want to lose cases. And so what we have is a great description of these cases of things you absolutely should, bars you should clear that are below the floor somewhere, and a guidance document, and everything in the middle it says to businesses, go figure it out, right? Go do what's reasonable. Their baseline here is reasonable, right? That's their whole idea. And there was another case that came out a couple years ago called LabMD, where LabMD said, I don't know what's reasonable. How the hell am I supposed to know what to do? And this is a weird case. They also challenged the FTC's authority. The judge kind of dodged that issue. But the judge came back and said, yeah, by not telling the business how to improve their security, you're micromanaging the business. Anyway, nothing seems to have changed after that opinion. They said these broad remedial orders, the FTC came out, whatever. Nobody really knows what the effect of that opinion is. It was 2018. The FTC seems to be proceeding on its course, but this is all recent developments, right? We don't exactly know what's going forth. So that's one way, right? Reasonableness also comes out in negligence lawsuits, right? The reasonableness, negligence, that's those are synonyms basically, right? So these suits target class action suits where people are settling for billions of dollars potentially, they're essentially negligence suits, right? And you can claim negligence with any kind of injury. Financial injury is usually the big one, and so negligence suits are another way that we can that the law tries to regulate these things. Individual suits face difficult problems, and this is where we run into the Supreme Court's doctrine of standing. And for those of you who are not law students and may not know what standing is, it essentially means you have to have what is referred to as a concrete and particularized injury in order to be heard, at least in federal court. States have similar obligations, sometimes not completely. What is a concrete and particularized injury? Well, the Supreme Court came back last year with another case that tried to tell us a little bit more. It was a case where the Fair Credit Reporting Act made it a violation to have an incorrect piece of information about you in a credit report and not be able to fix it, right? So the plaintiff in that case had credit reports. It was a class action. They had credit reports claiming they were terrorists. And they said, that's not okay, please fix it. And the people essentially laughed at them, right? And the Supreme Court came back and said, yeah, unless they gave your credit report to a third party that read you were a terrorist, you don't have standing. Because even though Congress said you have standing to the tune of $1,500 of damages for every violation, that's not a concrete enough injury. Now, where does this come to a data security question? Well, it turns out if people are hacked, right, it's not clear whether your data going to someone else is necessarily an injury, right? If your social security number is out there in the world, first of all, it's already out there in the world, so one more time, I don't know. But like, if it's out there in the world and you don't get your identity stolen, have you suffered an injury? And turns out courts are split on this, right? So in some sense, the risk of harm is itself the increased risk of harm is a legally cognizable injury, right? You have to protect yourself. You have to have credit monitoring services and things like that. You have to spend money on it. Other cases have said, no, this is just speculative. This is just a risk of harm. And this is an issue that's teed up in the future with this case that came down. Nobody really knows what's going on with an individual lawsuit. Let's see. So the last substantive thing I want to talk about are these private ordering schemes, right? And so this goes to the question of like, can industries self-police, right? So there are lots of individual private ordering schemes out there. The payment card industry, right, has the PCI data security standard. Which is enforced by a collection of like the 5 major credit card companies, and ultimately every contract that a payment system uses and adopts has this language that they opt in to this PCI data security scheme, right? So it's not legally enforceable from without, but the industry has created a situation such that every contract says you must abide by this existing standard, right? So it's using law to help an industry self-police, right? So that's a really interesting, different kind of model that gives individual industries much more agency over it. There's also vendor management frameworks, right? There are kind of standardized ideas out there that if you hire a vendor, you create clauses in your contracts that are going to make them liable for any breaches they cause. Right? And when when you get employed as a lawyer doing privacy and data security work, that's a lot of what you do is vendor management stuff. Because that's such a really important part of how this gets regulated is through private law. Private law is another way of addressing some of these issues. And I guess the ultimate question is, given the different contexts for different data security and cybersecurity, given what's needed is so different in each different context, right? And we need flexibility in order to figure out what standards should apply and how we even think about the fault of the sort of intermediate hacked player, right? We need to think about all the different ways that we might actually have law support business in creating in essentially self-policing. Part of it, I haven't even gotten to the political reality that we can't pass a lot of laws, so maybe we just need to come up with other ways to allow self-policing. The big question, at least for me here, is whether market incentives are there, right? a lot of this discussion of, reasonableness, what is the content of reasonableness? It often comes from existing industry standards, right? The law, even when it does do enforcement, draws on existing industry standards, and yet hacks are happening all the time. There are 1 million data breaches every day. So if market incentives can get it to work, right, if we don't need outside regulation, why haven't we done it yet? And I don't know the answer to this, right? Like, I don't know. I think it's said for a while that data security, people didn't take it seriously until it became a C-suite problem, right? But now it is, but how much of it is, right? How much can a business just get away with not caring? I don't know. And so I think these are a lot of open questions, are what form of legal regulation can it take? And law versus markets, like what can reputational harm even do if everybody's getting breached, right? Does it really hurt that much? I don't know. So I think the questions you're going to end up having to answer are kind of related to these. So I think that's a good time to leave off. So thank you, everyone.
So for the next 15 minutes or 20 minutes or so, we'd like to open this up to you for questions for the two professors. So let me invite you to do that. And I'll start with the first question while you're thinking of. So the question I have, after listening to both of you in this wonderful controversy as to who owns the problem and who should be responsible for resolving the problem, is what if we moved away from the concept of negligence and moved to strict liability as an experiment, and say for the next 5 years or next decade, any retailer who is the subject of a breach, and of course you could put some qualifications around that, but is the subject of a breach, is strictly liable, right? So there's no more controversy. You don't have to go into you have to go into court, but there are no defenses, right? Mm-hmm. Will that create the incentives that the businesses need, so that I think Professor Kramer's view that businesses might be the better place to find a solution than government, or would that create the incentives for them?
Yeah, my initial reaction is it's a blunt instrument. So you've got to be able to have a business see the impact on its consumers. You have to have a business feel as if there's a reasonable effort that they can take to solve a problem. So in this situation of this cybersecurity, the challenges, the risks, the cleverness of the hackers is getting pretty notable, much greater than I would submit than the capabilities of companies right now. So there's got to be a reasonableness range, to use your term again, but reasonableness range also for what a company can do, and also what actions. When I was in the State Department, we always talked about unintended consequences of policy. Because policy in the abstract always seems great, but then you have to say, okay, now how does a chess game play out here? And if companies say, listen, based on that liability, I'm not going to get into this business. I'm not going to provide this service. I'm going to add pricing. I'm going to raise pricing to accommodate for all this. Then you've harmed the consumer, in essence. So I worry about the blunt instrument. I would rather go back to seeing naughty behavior of business people. I remember we used to sign contracts. We'd always say, if in doubt, add the term willful misconduct or gross negligence. Those are the two most basic things as a business person I would remember. If that's happened, you've got a legitimate. So that would be my initial reaction to the scenario you posed.
Yeah, I mean, I actually mostly agree. I think, random executions are also something, if you could decrease the probability that you get randomly executed, it will create an incentive not to do certain things.
Oh, I'm in favor of those too.
Yeah, right. But fundamentally, I feel like strict liability for data breaches amounts to a degree to a probabilistic execution, right? Like the kind of damages we're talking about could make or break companies, and if they can't do anything about it, then it's almost like it's so bad that you kind of have to give in and doesn't create the incentive to try to do anything about it. You just recognize that there's a 5% chance that you're just going to not exist next year, and you have to live within the shadow of that. Maybe maybe it increases cyber insurance and makes that a much more much more applicable thing.
Just has any significant company been broken by these kinds of lawsuits? I don't think so, because there's cyber insurance.
Cyber insurance is not, as far as I understand, not like very easy to get, and I might be out of my depth on that one. If you can tell us more about cyber insurance.
I think you historically have been able to get it, so I don't know if that's changed. All right, opening it up.
My question is based on recent experience I had with Kramer. So I worked for a law firm over the summer that's in the tech industry, and we had, of course, cybersecurity training. We talked about how their first, second, third, and fourth concerns were phishing attacks, right? You get an email that says, that says, "Hi, it's me, your boss. What's your password?" Maybe take a second look at that email. I think we also see every day that a pretty visible source of cyber concern is misinformation by hostile state actors. So this is leading to the question, is our problem really technical barriers or vulnerable machines, or is it more exploitable people? And are those two problems actually that closely connected?
Go ahead. I think if you talk to security professionals, people are always the answer, right? They're almost always the weakest link, and there's only so much training can do, but ultimately, it's social attacks are just much more common and hard to deal with. I mean, I think they've probably gotten better over time as the general awareness has increased, but one cybersecurity training for half an hour every year, maybe it does something, but doesn't do enough, I think.
Yeah. No, I agree. And the companies have a responsibility to know that most consumers are not well educated on a variety of issues. So they have to kind of assume that people aren't understanding and trained to that level, and to test and to follow up on it. So I think there's a fair amount that companies do own and would be willing to own on that.
Hi, thanks so much. My question is about complacency. So it seems like, the alarm bells are getting louder and louder from leaders in business and government especially, relating to what we need to do now about cybersecurity concerns. At the same time, now that, as you said, everyone's been hacked, there's all these things on internet websites that at this point I'm just kind of used to ignoring. To be perfectly honest, the UC attack, I kind of ignored those emails for a while. It's so common. So is that going to affect sort of what the responses are if that sort of mentality becomes pervasive in our society? It just seems like right now it's still do we need a huge, awful event to happen before people take this more seriously? Or maybe I'm just sort of lazy about that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. Maybe it's glass half full or half empty. I actually think that people are more concerned and more aware now on a variety of these issues than they ever were. So if you look at social media as an example, the concern about your information and what's getting shared, et cetera, I think people are pretty worked up and concerned on that. I think what happened with Facebook on the Russian interference with the elections and what happened on January 6th, I think people are pretty aware of that. I just think the challenges are getting greater, but I don't think people are complacent. I think companies are more aware. I sit on a variety of boards, and the concerns and the liability on cybersecurity issues now is a discussion at a boardroom. It's just the number of incidents and attacks is getting greater. And that's why I'm a bit more excited about the technology-based solutions that can be scaled, that can be used to understand all the nuance at lower costs. I think that ultimately is going to be the best protection, even more than training, customers and employees.
I mostly agree. I could see it going in a sense in either direction. I think that's right, that right now there is a lot more awareness, a lot more concern than there used to be. So I don't know. I think in industry you have companies often moving lockstep, right? Not wanting to be the first out there a lot of the time, not wanting to stick their neck out. But that goes in both directions, right? If nobody's doing anything in an industry, then there's cover to not do anything. But if certain people are out there really concerned, then your industry potentially moves along with them. And at least the trend seems to be that people are more concerned. But I'm not sure that that's if they're not paying more financial penalties over time, right, when these hacks happen and they're increasing, then it's not clear to me that is a trend that will necessarily continue. So I don't know.
I think I have a follow-up on Adam's question a little bit, in that our firm similarly had like the trainings on that, but something that our IT group did was they would randomly send out phishing emails to us to test us, basically. And so it kind of kept us sharp, right? So maybe that is like the people weakest link aspect of it. I was curious about, I guess, like two different questions, and one might go more to Professor Cramer and one might go more to Professor Selbst. But I think it seems like there's been a shift away from minimal viable product testing. Lately, we've been trying to get things to market as fast as possible. And because of that, I feel like we could be doing some of this testing early on, and perhaps that would be a way to use tech to kind of like create this self-regulating aspect of it. But I am curious also at the later end of things, if maybe it doesn't require FDA type disclosure, but couldn't there also be some sort of regulatory solution at the later stages that, say, is running these tests that has people that are actually trained to do that kind of the way that my firm's IT department did? Okay. So I guess first side to Kramer maybe on the minimum viable product, and then the second side to Professor Selbst.
Yeah, I'm sure the speed of product releases is part of the problem. I wouldn't rate it as the number one issue. I don't think, people can say I'm rushing through, so I'm going to eliminate the cybersecurity risk. I think most innovators don't know what they don't know, because the types of attacks that are happening are changing so rapidly, and new means. I mean, look at some of the most quote-unquote conservative organizations, our US government, and they're getting breached as well. So I don't know if it's the speed of things. And just to be provocative for a second, I worry that some of these actions, again, create negative outcomes. And let me give you an example. It's not cybersecurity, but it's just general data and technology. You look at autonomous vehicles. And I always remember we had Raj Kapoor speak a year or so ago, who's the chief strategy officer at Lyft, and made the case for autonomous vehicles with ride sharing. So basically the average person only uses their vehicle 4% of the time. They spend $750 a month to support that car. And that car costs, in aggregate with all the other cars in the US, 40,000 deaths a year. Almost all of them are human related. So the extent to which you say, hey, listen, I want to make sure autonomous vehicles are picture perfect, it's very noble and very exciting, but every day and every week and every month you're waiting, 40,000 people die. So I think it's a bit dangerous to slow the wheels down too much, excuse the pun, because you're creating, again, the loss of benefit of the innovation. I would go back to whether you're seeing something that's egregious in nature. So if I look at tech companies as an example, we tend to kind of lump them all together, and I think this is what's so unfair. It's a little bit of bias in its own form, because we assume they're all kind of evil and they all do this and that. There's a spectrum of, to me, people that have been much more societally focused than others. Candidly, I'd put Facebook at the worst end. They're trying to do things, but they've had multiple warnings. It's like an employee that isn't performing well, and you've had them on a performance plan, and then you kind of, well, I'll look the other way, let me keep them on, and you just kind of argue your way into never doing anything. That's been them, because they've had Cambridge Analytica, they've had the Russian interference, they've had January 6th, blah, blah, blah. You have a bunch of companies that are really trying to address issues. Mark Benioff at Salesforce. He is all about the North Star, and that flows into all the product design for what they're doing with Einstein and their use of AI, et cetera. They're, to me, a very, very good company. You look at Google even, and they get a lot of criticism. I had Susan Wojcicki, who's the CEO of YouTube, speak, and she talked about content moderation on their platform. I was very impressed. And she went through the criteria they used, the people in the organization that own it. She went through the statistics of what's been taken down, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is why I worry a little bit kind of this like, let's slow things down and everybody's kind of been irresponsible. I worry that's creating more net negative and not acknowledging some of the good acts that are being seen now.
So here we're finally going to get to some disagreement. Okay, so the first thing I'll say on security, right? There's no perfect security. That's just sort of a baseline, like it's a defensive strategy. And so no matter what, you're gonna get, like, I mean, a lot of the hacks that we've seen of, like, Apple, right, recently are like 0-day attacks. They're doing their best, and still you're gonna find things that we can argue about whether they should have caught, but they don't. And the question is, what do they do to respond? How quickly do they patch it and things like that? So there's a question of how quickly you move things and do you test beforehand, but what might look like you're shipping things too early might also just be that hackers have gotten very good at this. At the same time, and I'm going to jump on a little soapbox here, we don't spend enough time talking about whether stuff works. Just works in a basic sense. I'm in the middle of we're writing a paper right now with some computer scientists talking about AI and ML, and a lot of people are talking about bias and discrimination. And literally the paper, if you'll excuse me, "This bleep doesn't work" is like the title of the paper at the moment. Because there's a very basic question of, is this functional? And security has to be part of the conversation of what it means for something to be functional. And so I don't know, one way to deal with that is actually to move to a strict liability framework, maybe. But if we're thinking about what negligence is, or I guess I should say in law, right, we're used to thinking about whether something is functional in product liability regimes, right? So for something like an autonomous vehicle, we could potentially talk about that. But in a case where you're not actually suing in product liability, the idea that a judge will go under the hood and ask what you designed for, what you tested for, and things like that is something that it's really hard to do because lawyers are afraid of tech. They think these tech wizards know what they're doing. They see a device that's a black box. They don't want to sort of look under the hood. They don't think they have the ability to do so in a lot of ways. Product liability is the one area where we ask about the design, but in a lot of other areas, we don't ask what kind of testing you did. Is it enough? What are the standards? And this is the approach that we have, and we need more of the basic question of did you test enough?
These would be the last three so that we can get to
Hi, it's kind of a follow-up to that. So the California tried, I'm going to go on the law side a little bit, the California Consumer Privacy Act. They tried to kind of come up with, like you said, a framework of here's my data, here's what you can do with it, here's what you can't do with it, here's how long you can keep it, things like that. Do you see that, and California a lot of times leads, do we see that going federal? Do we see that going to other states? It's kind of GDPR light from what and it kind of falls right in the middle, I think, between both of you. So love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the last 2 years or so, there have been a bunch of states that have passed various data privacy laws, right? There's California passed 2 of them somehow in the span of 2 years. And then Washington, Virginia, Colorado have all passed these laws. They're all slightly different. Washington looks most like the GDPR because Microsoft already did their best GDPR implementation and wants that to be the regulation. And other states have had other approaches to things. The more individual states there are, the more businesses are going to push for federal regulation that preempts state law and makes it all null. I don't know, there's a big fight. The preemption is the big fight, right? So the degree to which federal law overwrites and makes null individual state laws is going to be the big fight for the question. And I think for public interest advocates, for civil society, that's a sticking point that they're, to the extent they have any pull at all, right? Progressives, to the extent they have any pull at all, are fighting against this preemption idea. One possibility, and if there's no preemption, it's possible we don't get a federal law because businesses don't want just another kind of regulation. Sure. One possibility in environmental law, actually they grandfathered California and preempted the rest when they passed federal environmental laws. Maybe there's something like that, but that seems unlikely. So the future is uncertain, but I would say it's more likely than ever that we get some sort of federal law. What it looks like and whether it actually happens, given we can't get any federal law right now, pick them.
Yeah.
So Terry, I'm going to stop you for a moment.
Okay.
Because I want to get these other questions.
Sure.
Right.
So as everyone was asking questions, I have now 5 more questions, but I'll stick to my one that I had when I came up. So within a technology-based company, especially if they're looking to target cybersecurity as one of their branches, they have a lot of different things that they need to follow, which go through lawyers, it goes through tech specialists, subject matter experts, etc. So how much and of course the government is doing their fair share to combat hackers and other breaches that companies are facing. So how much of this growth in cybersecurity, especially over the last 5-10 years and into the future, do you feel like is going to be driven by the government versus customers and consumers of technology?
Yeah, so I believe it's going to be more by customers and people that are adversely affected. Because again, I think at the end of the day, if people feel their data is at risk, they will walk with their feet and they'll leave and they'll not use products and services. So I think that's going to be the biggest driver of concern out there. And then the related question to what you're asking is, what should companies be doing in this area? And to me, the most impressive companies, when you look at their core product design teams, they're very much focused on how the product should work, what are the unintended consequences. You see this a lot with bias and AI. They're looking at how the product actually is working in practice. They're looking at target user groups, et cetera. I think there's going to be more of that is going to drive the future. And I think to Andrew's point, although I'm not going to speak for you, but I think to his point, there's a certain amount of limitation that legal action and regulatory action can take. And at some point, you got to be symbolic and assume that companies are going to get the message and take action.
Thank you.
Final question.
So sorry, this is probably a bit of a philosophical question for the last question, but I think, Professor Kramer, you had mentioned several times that innovation is always good, but we've been on a long-term trend of inequality. So I would wonder how you'd reconcile that. And for your example with autonomous vehicles and cars, yes, cars create a lot of accidents, autonomous vehicles, but we had solutions. It was public transportation, which obviously there have been some issues with Amtrak, but that would have been a way to, have less people in charge and probably mitigate a lot of those accidents. But we had business come in, and it's very famous in LA, but get, rid of the rail cars, et cetera. So innovation doesn't always mean progress, it would seem. So how do you kind of reconcile that? And to go to the law aspect, it seems like a lot of tech companies, your Airbnbs and your Ubers basically create businesses that try to leapfrog over regulation with tech in order to circumvent existing consumer protections. So how do we kind of get to a point where people are being protected and innovation is actually progressing?
Yeah. Great question. So, and it's a philosophical question. I'm going to give you my own view on this. So, first of all, and don't take away from this evening, I'm saying innovation is all good. I'm saying innovation does a lot of good things, and in aggregate does a lot of great things, but there are a bunch of negative externalities. So what my message is in most cases, technology is going to be able to drive costs down, and it automates and it gets rid of jobs, et cetera, and that's partly how it drives costs down. It often will improve outcomes when you think about the use of data and judgment on data. Think about diagnostic tools in healthcare to be able to detect early onset of Alzheimer's, to be able to understand somebody that's likely to have cardiovascular disease, et cetera. You need a fair amount of data in a technology environment to really drive better outcomes there. So I'm saying in aggregate, it creates good things, but not in every case. Then this gets to the issue of what do you do with the inequalities? Because most of these technology-based solutions are job killers. So I tell my students when I look at their team projects that they do, 80% of their team projects are job killers. It's basically how they get to the ROI that they need to that would allow a customer to buy whatever it is they're using. But to say, okay, well, don't advance the technology, don't advance the solution, to me is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The next question is, what do you do to ensure that the inequity isn't out of control? And so then that gets into what's the job of a business when there are job losses? How much retraining do they do? When you look at the issue of autonomous vehicles, take truck drivers. A fascinating stat here, by the way, there's 4 million truck drivers in the US. When you look at the percent of population that are involved in truck driving, in Joplin, Missouri, the number's 10 times higher than the number in Los Angeles is. So the net job loss is going to be in Joplin, Missouri. It's not going to be here. So what is the obligation of businesses to create jobs in those areas, to retrain people, and ultimately, what do you do with income disparity? So if everything works in the future model, What you should have is a society that has lower costs of healthcare, which is one of the biggest expenses, lower costs of transportation. The cost of living our life should go down. Our income in aggregate is probably going to go down because, again, of automation. And then it's a question is, how do you create equity in compensation? Now, this gets more political and philosophical. I personally believe we're going to have to get to universal basic income or some solution like that. So my aggregate solution is, don't stop the technology. It's going to do some great things, but you better be ready to step up for managing what are going to be the inequalities, including redistribution of wealth, including hiring people, et cetera. That would be the final most important message I could leave you. It's so easy to take, again, the absolutist positions. Stop the technology. We have a bad healthcare system. We don't have great outcomes. We have a lot of people that don't have insurance. Don't stop the technology solutions in the process. Figure out how do you deal with the negative externalities.
Thank you.
I'll give you 1 minute.
Yeah, just one quick thing. I mean, the way you sort of moved from asking a question about autonomous vehicles to a question about sort of transportation and inequities, right? The answer, to bring it full circle to what Terry started with, is like, what's the problem? How are you going to solve it? The problem framing is the answer, right? Like, widening the lens, thinking about context, how you frame problems, leads to how you end up, like what solutions you end up with. And so I think the battle, I mean, like the battle for equity, the battle for justice is never ending. It's just a battle you either commit to or don't, you fight forever. And it's constantly a question of trying to get the most good, trying to get equitable outcomes, and often it involves asking different questions than are being asked. Just the way you pose the question, moving from a question about autonomous vehicles to a broader, we need to solve a transportation system in a way that advantages all people, that's a great move. So I would say keep doing that, right? That exact, reframe problems, ask different questions.
Thank you both.
So we have some questions.
We have one question from a remote participant here who was just wondering if we can bring pieces of regulation under a single umbrella. In other words, have one single regulatory body owning a problem end to end, such as the SEC.
Chairman Selbst.
I don't think so. And the answer is, the reason is context. I mean, I'm looking over here, but I guess I should look at the camera. The answer is context, right? Like, every sector is so different. The kinds of problems, the kinds of threats they face, the kinds of data they work with, the sizes of organizations creates very different approaches, what they can afford to spend, how much data they need to guard. You can have a combination of an overall sort of data security regulator that has jurisdiction over that and works with a bunch of sectoral laws, but you can't just have that because I think it's just too coarse a solution. You need some sort of sectoral specificity.
Yeah, completely agree. By the way, when I was in the State Department, I remember meeting with elected officials, members of Congress, et cetera. They are, in business terms, the most generalist-oriented of anybody. I want to talk to them about technology, the internet. It's like, oh, no, this is getting too involved. I'm worrying about, kind of jobs, and I'm worried about national security, et cetera. Even in regulation, these things are fairly specific. So to have one organization manage across all these, you end up with garbage in, garbage out. So I think it would actually move us backwards.
Well, thank you very much. Will you please join me in thanking our speakers?
Good, thank you. Good.